I first came across the Back of Beyond back in my undergraduate years. I was always struck that Australia's first internationally acclaimed art film was sponsored by a petroleum company. So the Back of Beyond was, it won the Grand Prix at the Venice Film Festival in 1954 and was really, I guess, a landmark of the 1950s era of Australian cinema. And back then I was struck by the alignment of artistic production and industry very naively. And I now know, having worked in the arts for several years, that those two things are, of course, deeply entwined and have always historically been deeply entwined. We can think about cultures of patronage and, of course, the imbrication of the fossil fuel industry in the arts today persists. Shell really began sponsoring films in Australia in the 1930s, and they made films for a huge range of reasons. We need to remember, in the early 20th century, the oil-intensive lifestyles that we inhabit today weren't yet second nature. So the production of films was very much part of this project of naturalizing oil in our lives, of selling the promise of new ways of moving across the land, new ways of working, new products, this sort of transformative potential of oil. In 1948, Shell, as you say, invited John Hire, and he formed the Shell Film Unit Australia. So this was an in-house production team. At the time, Shell, which was a multinational based in London and also the Netherlands, had a whole sort of transnational network of film units that radiated out from the metropole. So what was happening here in Australia was just one part of this broader circuit that went across the world, from Egypt, Venezuela, parts of Southeast Asia, and so on. As well as making films, Shell was also actively invested in distributing and exhibiting them. So they had theaterettes in each capital city. They had a 16mm lending library. So if your organisation, your classroom, your church, your advocacy group had 16mm projection capabilities, you could loan a film from Shell. And they also had a fleet of mobile film units. These mobile film units were these vans equipped with generators, equipped with drop-down screens with 16mm projectors, and also with films that circled all around Australia, showing films in tiny townships, at pastoral stations, in places where there wasn't necessarily a fixed commercial picture palace nearby. So I guess just to zoom back from what I've been saying, the company was invested in the production, distribution and exhibition of cinema in Australia across the mid-century. So in this way, it was a fully vertically integrated ecosystem, kind of like a Hollywood studio. Yeah. So it's a really significant form of industrially sponsored filmmaking that, as you say, is not really well known. Travelogues are a part of the lineage. They're the sort of the mid-century bread and butter, these narratives. And just to go to your question about what is a travelogue, as I understand it, and having watched now quite a lot of them, they all tend to follow the same formula. Okay. It's documenting movement across space. I can talk specifically about a Shell film called Through the Centre, which is a film that it sets out from point A. It goes usually through the north and the centre of Australia, which at the time in that mid-century moment was such a sort of a frontier for the settler imagination. And then it sort of safely returns back to point B. And why there are so many films that are travelogues in Shell's corpus is quite obvious, because it is a documentary that can showcase the promise of oil in its as a means of travelling across the land, collapsing time and space. So travelogues are really key to the sort of, not just the oil sort of cinematic imaginary, but as you mentioned, like the cinematic imaginary of Australia more broadly, and even like a kind of national ethos, because the stories that these travelogues tell, they're the sort of same stories we see repeated from explorers' journals, and then 19th century bush ballads and painting culture. So, the construction of Australia as a settler nation is so founded on these stories of heroic overcoming of a so-called hostile or intractable land.